The trial of John Demjanjuk, a 73-year-old Ukrainian-born American citizen accused of being notorious concentration camp guard Ivan the Terrible, had captured world attention as it proceeded from 1986 to 88. He was found guilty of all charges by the court in Jerusalem and sentenced to death, but the execution was delayed while an appeal was heard. In July 1993, the appeals court saw new evidence that identified Ivan the Terrible as someone else, and it was also decided that the prosecution had been so fixated on proving Demjanjuk was Ivan that they hadn't actually addressed any specific crimes he may have committed during his time as a guard at Sobibor, Majdanek and others. So he was acquitted, to predictable and understandable outrage in Israel and celebration in Ukraine, where President Leonid Kravchuk offered him an invitation to return to the country. Demjanjuk, however, decided to return to Cleveland, where he'd worked before retirement. King Baudouin of the Belgians died aged 62 while on holiday in Spain. He'd been on the throne since the abdication of his father Leopold III in 1951 amid the political fallout from the surrender of Belgium in 1940. Baudouin had presided over the end of the Belgian rule in the Congo, though at the formal handover of power he praised his ancestor Leopold II as a genius, which didn't go down too well with Patrice Lumumba, the incoming head of independent Congo. The rift between the two men escalated when the resource-rich region of Katanga tried to secede, which was backed by the Belgian government. Lumumba was kidnapped, beaten, released, recaptured and then murdered in 1961, an act of which Baudouin was informed and to which he didn't object, though there's no evidence he actually ordered it. In 1976 he founded the King Baudouin Foundation, aimed at improving living standards in Belgium, and it's presumably for this work that in 2024 the Catholic Church began the process of canonising him as a servant of God. Baudouin's death was unexpected, and was announced 15 hours into the 24 Hours of Spa, which was abandoned at that point, and after a minute's silence and the singing of the Belgian national anthem, leaders Uwe Altsen, Christian Fittipaldi and Jean-Pierre Jarier were declared the winners in their Porsche 911, though attention was naturally focused on local driver Eric van der Poel. Porsche had dominated the event to such an extent that the top 5 cars classified at the end were all 911s. Thanks to our diversion into the crazy world of NASCAR last week, there are 3 Indy races to report on. Fresh off his Grand Slam in Cleveland, Paul Tracy was on a high as he headed for Toronto, his own hometown, as well as that of Scott Goodyear, the other Canadian on the grid. Making his first, and as it would turn out only, appearance in IndyCar racing was Bertrand Gachot, replacing Lynn St James for Dick Simon. Mo hadn't read the script though, and qualified on pole with Tracy alongside, while Mansell was back in 9th after 2 qualifying crashes. A couple of early yellows kept the cars bunched up, including a 4-car traffic jam occasioned by Montemini spinning on his own oil. When they restarted, Tracy got ahead of his teammate, while Mansell had dropped to 12th and was having a hard time making any headway. With the championship lead thus hampered, Fittipaldi decided to let Tracy go and have his home win, but he didn't have it all his own way, a botched pit stop putting Mo back in front. Another yellow brought them all back together again, with Sullivan and Unser right behind the Penskes as Mansell trailed in to retire with a dud engine. Tracy's second stop was judged just right and put him back out into the lead, which he held to the end, the first Canadian to win a race on home soil since Gilles Villeneuve in the F1 Grand Prix in 1978. That put Mo top of the table as they headed to the Michigan 500, and whatever was wrong with Mansell and his car in Toronto had clearly been fixed, and Mansell and Andretti duked it out for pole, despite Nigel's vocal dislike of the bumpy track. In the end it was Mario who took the pole with the fastest average lap speed ever done by an IndyCar up to that point. He'd also been on pole here at the first Michigan 500 in 1968. He won on that occasion and led away here from the lead, while Luyendyk nabbed second. By the time Mansell finally forced his way back past the Dutchman, Andretti was way ahead. He soon reeled in his veteran teammate, though took the lead, and was aided when Mario had an uncharacteristic spin as he was leaving his pit when they both stopped together, which also lost Andretti second to Boesel. Tracy's engine broke, Fittipaldi was struggling with handling, and nothing could stop Mansell and Andretti charging home to take a 1-2 for Newman Haas, though Mario pushed Nigel all the way as Mansell retook the championship lead. And finally it was Loudon, New Hampshire, on Mansell's 40th birthday, and he took pole to celebrate, with Boesel alongside, Paul Tracy behind, and Fittipaldi back in 13th, even though he was only 7/10 slower than Mansell. As Mansell led from the first yellow, the 2 Canadians had a scrap over third, eventually won by Tracy, who then charged up behind Mansell and took the lead, with Fittipaldi making his way up to third behind them. Another yellow and a pit stop saw Mansell back in front, and now Fittipaldi took second from his teammate. The Penskes were both closing on Mansell in the final stages of the race and caught up when Nigel was delayed by lapping back markers. Mansell defended from Fittipaldi but was caught out by Tracy going round the outside from third. The top three continued running right together as they wove their way through traffic, and when Boesel, running fourth, hit the wall, Mansell pitted, only for a cross-threaded wheel nut to cost him second. There was another yellow when Goodyear and Andretti collided, and when they restarted, Mansell put on one of his famous charges, taking Fittipaldi and then chasing down Tracy, who was making his Penske as wide as possible. But Mansell went round the outside with 4 laps to go, was held up by his old mate Olivier Guillard, which gave Tracy the chance to come back, and the two raced all the way to the finish, Mansell just taking the win, followed by Tracy, Fittipaldi and Guerrero. All of that put Mansell 25 points in the lead over Fittipaldi, with Paul Tracy taking third from a flagging Boesel, who was now just a point ahead of fifth-placed Andretti with 5 races to go. There was more political toing and froing in the 3-week gap between Grand Prix, as a legal challenge to the ruling on driver aids went predictably nowhere, but further controversy was stirred when FISA refused to homologate Elf's fuel, despite several independent labs having deemed it legal. The previous united front of Elf, Shell, BP, Sasol and Egypt fell apart, and the French firm was left to fend for itself, claiming that this was just another way of trying to nerf the dominant Williamses and put pressure on Renault to agree to supply either Benetton or McLaren in the cause of more even racing next year. A summit meeting between FISA technical delegate Charlie Whiting, Elf's head of special fuels, and several of their clients, including Williams, Dudo and Head, Briatore and Byrne, and Carmen Ziegler of Sauber, degenerated into a shouting match and then got bogged down in technical details and accomplished nothing. Both McLaren and Benetton were very interested in acquiring those dominant Renault V10s for next year, though still McLaren had the issue that Shell and Renault wouldn't work together, while the French firm themselves were publicly at least saying they were entirely focused on Williams and indeed were about to launch a rally-spec Renault Clio Williams onto the market. Renault being solely focused on Williams was news to Cyril de Rouver and the Ligier team, of course, but that was by the by. And the Hungarian Grand Prix itself nearly didn't happen either. The circuit owners balked at the fees charged by FOCA and asked for a discount, while the Hungarian press laid into the apparently chaotic and incompetent management of the track. Bernie was unimpressed, pointing out that F1's arrival in Hungary during the Iron Curtain years had benefited the country and its car industry immensely, and it was only thanks to a cash injection from Philip Morris Tobacco that the bills were paid and the race could happen. Things were tense at Ferrari, where Jean Todt opened up Motor Magazine Quattro Ruote and found a pretty detailed sketch of John Barnard's top-secret new 1994 lateral gearbox, and sent a scorching memo round Maranello to the tune that if he ever found anyone leaking, they'd be out so fast their feet wouldn't touch the ground. Entirely understandable, but Ferrari being Ferrari, it was also seen as a political gambit by Todt to stamp his authority on the team. Gerhard Berger missed all the fun, having taken a couple of weeks off to rest an inflamed right elbow, so it was Alesi and Laurini's turn to pound endlessly around Fiorano trying to get the active suspension right. Over at Benetton, things were also a little tense, as Flavio Briatore informed Riccardo Patrese that his services would not be required in 1994 and that his 2-year contract was being paid off early, following in the footsteps of Nelson Piquet and Martin Brundle, as Michael Schumacher's teammates disposed of rather unceremoniously. Perhaps casting an eye at the struggles of fellow veterans Alboreto and Boutsen, Ricciardo indicated that if he didn't find a good drive, he was inclined to retire at the end of the year. Tension too at McLaren, where Ron Dennis seemed to finally be losing patience with Michael Andretti's lack of progress, and the American was being increasingly vocal about his dislike of the car. Word was that Mika Hakkinen might be replacing him before the end of the season. Indeed, a knot of Finnish fans at the Hungaroring were spotted with a banner reading "Andretti Go Home." This weekend at least, though, Mika and his fans had to console themselves with a support race, taking his second win of the year in the inaugural Porsche Super Cup, though he wasn't eligible to actually score points because he was a guest driver. The cars took to the track with most sporting big rear wing overhangs to maximise downforce on this twisty circuit, and Ligier having finally decided to abandon their active suspension programme, given it was about to be banned, but only after having spent 3 million francs trying to get it working, while the Lolas were sporting yet another revision to the front suspension, and the Minardis had a new monoshock rear suspension. Hungary was the only circuit other than Silverstone where Damon Hill had qualified the Brabham last year, and he looked very comfortable on his second visit, while Prost battled oversteer and had 3 spins across the 2 days. Still, Alain was fastest on Friday with Schumacher second, then Hill and Prix, with Senna relegated to fifth after the McLaren team spent the session dialling in new active suspension software. The new suspension on the Minardi, though, had helped no end, with Martini ending the day sixth despite still healing his cracked rib. Saturday saw times tumble across the board as usual as the dust was swept off the track and a layer of rubber put down, and a terrific scrap for pole between the two Williams drivers ensued, with both Benettons suffering from vibration and dropping out of contention. Despite his oversteer, Prost took yet another pole, almost a full second ahead of Patrese 1992 pole time, with Hill just 0.2 seconds behind. Though, as a new feature at the Hungaroring, the lap had been split into 3 sectors, and Hill had the fastest time in each individual sector, he just hadn't done all 3 on the same lap. Schumacher made third and Senna fourth, with Patrese dropping a place to fifth ahead of Berger. Martini was an excellent seventh, proving Friday's time wasn't a fluke, lining up alongside Jean Alesi, who was hampered by a number of engine cutouts. The footworks were still going well too, with Warwick and Suzuki colonising row 5 ahead of Andretti, who'd collided with Katayama, then the Ligiers, which were twitchy on the bumps at the best of times, especially without their active suspension. Everyone else suffered too. Fittipaldi had a couple of big offs while pushing, the Jordans and Saubers oversteered, the Loti had a series of mechanical problems, the LaRussas had shock absorber issues, and the Tyrrells spent most of their time either in the garage, De Cesaris, or the gravel traps, Katayama. The Lolas were last of course, but were starting to creep up on the others, and were now only 1 second off the next slowest car. Sunday dawned scorching hot, the stands looking rather empty, which wouldn't help the circuit's prospects of retaining its Grand Prix. The cars lined up on the grid, a Williams on pole for the 20th race in a row. Away they went for the parade lap, except for Prost, who, having spent a lot of time in the intervening 3 weeks practising his starts, managed to stall it and had to set off belatedly and take the start from last place. So, Hill was effectively on pole, with Schumacher having a clear track ahead of him too. Prost had never won the Hungarian Grand Prix, and it looked like he wasn't going to this year either. The lights went green and Damon got a great start, but Schumacher spun his wheels slightly and then ran wide at turn 1, allowing Senna, Berger and Patrese to all pile past. Alesi had a great start from 8th and dove inside Schumacher to take 5th at turn 2, with Andretti likewise having had a good start and was up to 7th. Schumacher quickly got back ahead of Alesi while Senna was fending off a feisty Berger. Barrichello, meanwhile, was punted off by a slow-starting Suzuki, shedding his front right wheel as he bounced across the grass. So as lap 1 finished, Hill led Senna and Berger, with Schumacher taking 4th off Patrese as they crossed the line, then Alesi, Andretti in 7th, then Warwick, Martini and Brundle. Prost, meanwhile, had progressed to 22nd, and De Cesaris came in with yet another dirt gearbox, which the team poked a bit and sent him back out again after 3 minutes. Hill started to pull away from Senna, who had in turn shaken off Berger, the Austrian now having to defend against Schumacher. Gerhardt seemed to have rediscovered his racing form of late and was driving a spirited defence at a track where it's tricky to pass at the best of times. He was clearly holding Schumacher up, but not for long. As they began lap 4, the Benetton moved out, caught a big wobble, then passed the Ferrari round the outside of turn 1. A great move, and Patrese was soon looking to replicate it, only for Schumacher to blot his copybook by putting a wheel on a dusty bit and heading backwards onto the grass. He kept it running and rejoined 10th with very dusty tyres, as Prost moved up to 18th, passing Blundell, who'd also been balked by Suzuki off the line. So at the end of lap 5, Hill led Senna by just under 3 seconds, chased by the trio of Berger, Alesi and Patrese, while Schumacher was making his way back towards them, disposing of Martini, then Warwick to get back to 7th, and Prost had passed both Loti to make it up to 16th. Hill was still pulling away from Senna at nearly a second a lap at this point, as Schumacher motored up behind Andretti, both closing on the Patrese sandwich, as Berger's defence against Patrese was slowing them all up. Michael Andretti, though, was proving a tougher nut to crack than Martini or Warwick, and Schumacher was spending more time than he would have liked to staring at the word Marlborough on the American's rear wing. Prost was still going great guns, passing Comas, Fittipaldi and Leto before getting a bit stuck behind Suzuki, as Andretti, with Schumacher in tow, closed up on Patrese and co., who were falling ever further behind second-place Senna, who now had 13 seconds on Berger at the head of the train. The Ferraris hadn't got the extra deck of wing on the back, which was slowing him up through the corners, but meant he had just that little bit of extra speed on the straights to stay in front. By lap 14, Hill was nearly 10 seconds ahead of Senna and had lapped the delayed De Cesaris, while Prost was up to 11th and chasing Brundle to get back into the top 10. Andretti's luck continued to be all bad as his throttle cut out, leaving him coasting to a halt, which wouldn't help his case any, even though this one was hardly his fault. That moved Prost up a place, as he also took Brundle and was now in 8th. Suddenly, with nearly 60 laps to go, a win for Prost didn't seem so unlikely after all. Next up was Warwick, then the Berger-Patrese-Alesi-Schumacher battle. The German had lapped 3 seconds quicker after Andretti's departure, had passed Alesi off camera, and was now harrying his own teammate for 4th. Andretti could feel some measure of satisfaction from the fact that Senna's throttle also failed, putting the Brazilian out on lap 18, and if Prost's progress continued, probably holding his championship hopes below the waterline. That promoted Berger to 2nd, but he had Schumacher right under his rear wing, having already passed Patrese. In a repeat of his earlier move, he dove round the outside at turn 1, while Alesi came in for tyres, returning to the track 12th. Berger was in next time around and rejoined just behind Alesi. All of which meant Hill now led Schumacher by over 38 seconds, enough time to make a stop himself without losing the lead, as long as everything went well, with Patrese some 6 seconds behind Schumacher, and Prost now 4th and closing in on Ricciardo. But before he could get past, it was his turn to pit, and as his tyres were being changed, someone spotted a crack in his rear wing pillar. There was nothing for it but to change the entire rear wing assembly, an operation that involved taking the engine cover off and would take several minutes. The team pushed Prost's car into the garage so Hill could make a tyre stop, but while they were sorting themselves out, Alesi, recovering from his own stop, went to pass Fittipaldi for 9th on the main straight, but the Minardi moved left slightly. There was the tiniest contact, but it was enough to make the Ferrari jerk left, hit the marbles and go flying off the track, skipping across the gravel like a flat stone on a lake and bury its nose in the Armco. Unseen by the cameras, Fittipaldi had also damaged his car in the incident and pulled off, slightly more serenely, into the gravel trap, and both drivers headed back to the paddock for a full and frank exchange of views. Hill was in and out in a careful 6.7 seconds, rejoining without having lost his lead, while Zanardi, still driving with broken toes, bounced down the hill and rejoined, heading back in for new tyres, having only just put on his current set 9 laps earlier. If not for that, he would have been able to capitalise on Eric Comas's long stop when the Frenchman came in from 11th. Schumacher was in next, a decent 6-second stop, rejoining 3rd behind Patrese, who as yet hadn't been in. But before Michael had been able to warm his tyres properly, he had another spin, but this time his fuel pump gave out too, and he rolled to a stop in an escape road, just as Prost finally returned to the track, 6 laps down and probably wondering why he was bothering. Derek Warwick, meanwhile, was up to 3rd in his footwork, though Patrese ahead of him had plenty of time to get in and out in 2nd place, while Martini came in from 4th. A long stop dropped him to 6th, while Warwick and Brundle came in together next time round, lap 31, and emerged together as well, just in front of Martini, all of which put Berger back up into 3rd. As half-distance approached, Patrese put up the fastest lap, but the best viewing on track was the 3-way scrap between Warwick, Brundle and Martini over the 3 lower points positions. Hill was leading by absolutely miles, lapping Gerhard Berger on lap 36, meaning that only Patrese was now on the same lap, and he was nearly a minute behind, and it was looking like Hill would lap the entire field before long. The Warwick-Brundle-Martini scrap bunched up when Derek was held up by De Cesaris through the infield, and Herbert had also attached himself to the back as the half-distance mark arrived. Not for long, though, as a data logger box fell off the inside of Johnny's cockpit and trapped his arm, pitching the Lotus into a spin and out of the race. He was joined in retirement by Luca Baudouin, who encountered a perennial problem with the Lola chassis. It proved very unstable as the fuel load lightened. The following lap, Alboreto retired in the pits with a broken fuel hose. Despite his inauspicious start, Aguri Suzuki had been having a good race and was scrapping over 7th with Wendlinger when he swapped ends, stalled and was out, while his teammate Warwick was still fighting with Brundle, both having now left Martini behind a bit. Behind the Minardi, Blundell had taken over the pursuit of Wendlinger from Suzuki, with the LaRusses running together behind him in 9th and 10th. Hill came in for a 2nd stop on lap 46, nearly taking out a Marshall who chose a bad moment across the pit lane, and had plenty of time to have a relatively slow, nearly 8-second stop and still get back out in the lead. Blundell followed suit, trying to find an advantage over Wendlinger, but stalled on his exit and had to be push-started. Lotus's bad race was ended on the following lap when Zanardi's gearbox failed, while Wendlinger came in for his own 2nd stop, getting out still ahead of the delayed Blundell. Katayama also came in and emerged right into the path of Damon Hill, who was just in the process of lapping De Cesaris, but other than a slightly hairy moment, no harm was done. Berger made a second stop which dropped him to 6th and put Warwick back into the podium places, though again Prix had plenty of time to change his tyres and be in no danger of losing second. Comas dropped out with an oil pressure drop on lap 55, while Berger was recovering past Martini, and Warwick was still being pressed hard by Brundle. When the two British veterans were held up by Italian veteran De Cesaris, the Austrian veteran Berger was able to get right on their tail, while Martini dived in for new boots without losing 6th. Without much hope of doing anything substantive at this point, Prost, running last and 7 laps down, came in for new tyres and went out to set what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race. On lap 59, Berger braked very late into turn 12 and would have gone straight on if he hadn't bounced off Brundle instead, the Ferrari's rear wheel bouncing off the Ligier's front and slightly deranging its steering. Before long, Berger was right behind Warwick, who was chasing his first F1 podium since driving for Renault in 1984, but was doing so on worn tyres, having only stopped once. Nonetheless, both men had enough experience that neither was going to give in easily. Martini's great race came to a sad end on lap 60 when he put a wheel on a dirty bit and clobbered the barriers, while Warwick finally got past De Cesaris as Brundle peeled in for new tyres, keeping his 5th place as Martini's 6th had been inherited by Wendlinger. For lap after lap, Berger followed in Warwick's wheel tracks until finally, on lap 66, he got his nose inside into turn 1, forcing Derek to either lift or crash, and took the place, to the delight of the large Austrian contingent at the circuit. Hill, meanwhile, with 11 laps to go before the end, was approaching second-place Prix to lap the entire field, though he seemed to decide at that point to back off, sparing his car with the memory of the last 2 races still fresh in his mind and a cramp beginning to make itself felt in his leg. Brundle, for his part, was certainly not backing off, gaining hand over fist on Warwick, hoping to nab that extra point with 5 laps to go, but as the camera switched back to Hill, as Berger approached to unlap himself and Hill began his last lap, Brundle's gear selector started playing up, and he was forced to drop his attack. Hill drove the last lap with his heart in his mouth, but this time everything worked out, and he swept home to take his first Grand Prix win in his 13th start, with Riccardo Patrese coming home a lonely but very satisfied second to stake his claim for a drive in 1994. Berger was third and, having just unlapped himself, was the last man on the lead lap, with Warwick taking 4th, Brundle 5th, and Wendlinger 6th to score his second point of the year. 4 of the top 6 had had their best finish of the year, while 1, Wendlinger, had equalled his. The remaining finishers were Blundell, Alliot, Boutsen, Katayama, De Cesaris and Prost, with both Tyrrells finishing for just the second time all year. Hill limped out of his car, exhausted and cramped but exhilarated, and headed for the podium, where the marshals struggled to hold back crowds of red-clad Austrian flag-waving fans. A cheeky bow to the crowd from Hill, a visibly stiff arm from Berger, and a broad grin from Patrese. "Berger! Berger! Berger!" chanted the crowd below the rostrum, but it didn't seem to dampen Damon's grin. Patrese's enthusiasm, however, had been slightly dented when Flavio Briatore wasn't at the finish to congratulate him, having left the circuit as soon as Schumacher retired. And so, with Prost, Senna and Schumacher all falling by the wayside, Hill climbed back up to 3rd in the championship and now 12 points behind Senna, while Benetton were able to draw level with McLaren in the Ford HP Stakes, and Ferrari overtook Lotus and closed in on Ligier in 4th. Hill had had an absolutely dominant win, but the early exit of most of the other contenders would mean some were still not entirely convinced, and he would be aiming to build on his success and convince them in 2 weeks' time at Spa-Francorchamps. After the race, Senna conceded the title to Prost after his 5th race in a row without standing on the podium. Though in theory a 27-point deficit with 5 races left could be overcome, it just seemed a bit unlikely at this point. And finally, just before I go, it was my birthday last week and my wonderful wife treated me to the Lego Williams FW14B with its teeny tiny Nigel Mansell. For entirely understandable reasons, Lego declined to provide stickers with tobacco and alcohol advertising on them, but I did find some aftermarket ones which look really great, so if anyone else is looking for the same thing, I can recommend Matt's Brick Mox. He does a set for Patrese's number 6 car too, if you prefer. Link in the down there part, as ever.